It began with the sound of bells. Soft, bright, and promising. Echoing across the valley that morning. They rang for a wedding that never happened. In the small town of Elmsridge, people still remember that day, not for the celebration that was meant to be, but for the silence that followed. It was late spring 25 years ago, when the bride vanished just hours before she was meant to walk down the aisle. Her dress hung untouched in the upstairs room. Her bouquet, hand-tied with white ribbon, sat in a jar of water on the windowsill. And her shoes, small, ivory, and new, were still by the bed. But she was gone. First, no one believed it. They thought she'd gotten cold feet, that she'd gone for a walk to calm herself, maybe even slipped away to collect her thoughts. But as the hours stretched and the sun dipped low over the town, unease crept in. By nightfall, the groom was sitting on the church steps, his face pale under the yellow streetlights, answering the same questions from the police again and again. Where was the last place he saw her? What did they talk about that morning? Had they argued? He said no. He said she was happy. He said they'd been together since school, and that she'd smiled at him before she went upstairs to get ready. He swore he'd never hurt her, and for a while most believed him. But not everyone did. In towns like Elmsridge, where people still leave their doors unlocked and memories stay longer than truth, rumors have a way of settling like dust. Some said she'd run off with an old lover. Others whispered that she'd discovered something terrible about him. A few believed she'd been taken, that someone out there still knew what happened but never spoke. The police searched for weeks. Drones hovered over the riverbanks. Dogs combed the woods. Volunteers scoured the old railway yard. They found nothing. Not a trace of fabric, not a footprint, not a body. It was as if she had simply disappeared. The groom became a figure of quiet tragedy. He stayed in town, kept to himself, and over the years, his house on the edge of the woods grew darker, quieter. Some thought he stayed out of loyalty. Others thought it was guilt. But no one asked. The years passed, and the story faded into local folklore. The vanishing bride of Elmsridge, until 25 years later. It was a winter morning when he walked into the police station, older now, gray at the temples, shoulders bent. He asked to speak with someone privately. The clerk on duty, young and confused, took him to an interview room. He sat down, folded his hands, and said quietly, "I think it's time I told the truth about what happened that day. But to understand his confession, we have to return to the morning of the wedding, to that house filled with flowers and quiet excitement. The air was soft with perfume. Sunlight fell through lace curtains. The bride's mother was downstairs arranging bouquets, and the bridesmaids were laughing in the kitchen, pinning ribbons on the chairs. The groom had arrived early, carrying a small box. Inside was a silver bracelet engraved with their initials and the date, May 14th. He wanted to give it to her before the ceremony, just a small surprise. He knocked on the bedroom door. She opened it halfway. He saw her reflection in the mirror, calm, maybe even distant. "You're not supposed to see me before the wedding," she teased softly. He smiled, holding up the box. "Just one thing." She hesitated, then let him in. They sat on the edge of the bed. He noticed she hadn't put on her dress yet, only the white slip beneath. Her eyes looked tired, as if she hadn't slept. She opened the box and traced the engraving with her finger. But she didn't smile. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. "But you don't have to keep trying." "Trying?" he asked. She looked up. "To make me sure." He laughed nervously, unsure how to respond. But she didn't laugh. She said there were things she needed to tell him before they married, things she'd kept to herself. He told her it could wait until after the wedding. She shook her head. "You deserve to know before we start our life," she said. "There's something you'll find out one day, and I'd rather it come from me." He remembered that moment vividly. The way she looked at him, calm, serious, almost sad. He tried to stop her, to tell her whatever it was didn't matter. But she wouldn't listen. She reached for the small envelope on the dresser. It was sealed with his name written on it. She said it contained the truth that if he loved her, he'd read it only if something ever happened to her. He frowned, confused. She smiled faintly and said she'd be downstairs in 10 minutes. She never came down. Later, when they searched her room, the envelope was gone. So were her car keys. But the car was still in the driveway, untouched. The only sign of movement was a faint scuff mark near the back door, like someone had slipped or been pulled. The police couldn't tell which. There were no fingerprints, no struggle, no witnesses. Just that mark, and one neighbor who claimed to have seen a white car idling near the gate around noon. The groom was questioned for days. He swore he didn't know whose car it was. He said he thought it belonged to a florist or maybe one of the guests. But later, when detectives checked the guest list, no one owned a white car. None of the florists did either. The lead detective, an old man named Carter, suspected foul play. But there was nothing to hold him on. The bride's disappearance remained unsolved. In the months that followed, the groom's life fell apart. The whispers never stopped. His business failed. Friends avoided him. Her parents moved away. And every year, on May 14th, he left a single white rose on the church steps. He never remarried. Now, 25 years later, the same detective, retired but still living in town, received a call from the station. The young officer said, "He's here. He says he wants to confess." When Carter arrived, the groom was sitting alone in the interview room, his hands trembling. On the table before him lay a small, weathered envelope, yellowed with age, the seal unbroken. "I kept it all these years," he said. "I thought she wanted me to, but I read it last night, and now I understand." Carter leaned forward. "Understand what?" The man looked up, tears welling in his eyes. "Why she disappeared." The confession began like a memory trying to surface. Halting, uncertain. He said it had haunted him for years, that he'd buried the truth so deep he almost believed his own lies. He told Carter about that morning, about the envelope she'd given him, about how she'd seemed scared but resigned. And then he said something that made Carter stop writing. "She didn't run away," the groom whispered. "She never got the chance." Carter's pen froze. "What do you mean?" The man's voice cracked. "Because I followed her." He explained that after she left the room, he waited only a few minutes before panic set in. He wanted to know what she'd meant by the truth. He couldn't stand not knowing. He went upstairs again, but she wasn't there. Her purse was missing. He went outside, saw her walking toward the woods behind the house, still in her slip, holding the envelope. He called out, but she didn't stop. He followed her through the trees, shouting her name. She turned once, startled, frightened, then slipped on the muddy slope near the riverbank. He ran toward her. She screamed. He reached for her hand, but she pulled back, lost her footing, and fell into the water. He paused, eyes distant. "I thought she'd come up," he said quietly. "But she didn't." Carter stared at him, disbelieving. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" He looked up, hollow. "Because I couldn't find her body. And I knew no one would believe it was an accident." The room fell silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent light above them. "I searched for hours," he continued. "Then I went home and cleaned up. When the police arrived, I told them I hadn't seen her since the morning. I didn't lie about everything, just enough to survive." Carter leaned back in his chair. The air felt heavy. After all these years, after all the theories and rumors, the truth was painfully ordinary. There had been no murder, no abduction, no secret lover. Just fear, misunderstanding, and a single irreversible mistake. The groom opened the envelope and slid it across the table. Inside was a letter, the ink faded but still legible. Carter began to read. "If you're reading this, it means something went wrong. I wanted to tell you before we married. I was never unfaithful, but there was someone once, long before you, and I think he's been following me. I've seen the car outside the house at night. I didn't want to worry you before the wedding, but if anything happens, please tell the truth. Whatever happens, don't blame yourself." Carter looked up slowly. "You thought she was leaving you," he said. "But she was trying to protect you." The groom nodded weakly. "I know that now." He lowered his head, sobbing quietly. Not the sound of guilt alone, but of a life spent carrying silence. That night, after the statement was signed, Carter walked him out into the cold air. Snow had started to fall. The old man paused beside the station steps. "Do you think they'll find her?" the groom asked softly. Carter looked toward the dark outline of the hills. "After all these years? Maybe, maybe not. But you did the right thing, finally." The groom nodded. "I don't know if that matters anymore." He walked away slowly, disappearing into the white blur of snow. For a long time, Carter watched him go, the sound of the bells from the old church echoing faintly in the distance. The same bells that had rung 25 years ago, for a wedding that never came. And somewhere beyond those hills, under the shifting earth and riverbed, the truth waited not to punish, but to be remembered. The next morning, the town awoke to news that felt both unreal and inevitable. After 25 years of silence, the man once called the grieving groom had confessed, not to murder, not entirely to guilt, but to something heavier, truth withheld. It spread quietly, like mist over cold ground. The few who still remembered the vanished bride whispered again, their faces half hidden behind curtains. At the bakery, someone murmured that justice had finally come. At the church, the priest simply said, "No secret survives forever." By noon, the case had been reopened. Detective Carter, though officially retired, was brought in as a consultant. He sat in his old chair, now creaking under the years, and stared at the thin folder marked Elms Ridge Disappearance, 1998. The paper smelled faintly of dust and regret. He'd kept it all this time, hoping for closure that never came. Now perhaps it had. But something about the confession unsettled him. Felt incomplete. He'd seen remorse before, the kind that poured out too neatly, as if rehearsed in the mind for years. This man's story was raw, yes, but there was still a silence behind it. A silence that didn't fit. Carter reopened the file and spread the old photographs across the desk. The house, the riverbank, the faint scuff mark near the back door. He remembered standing there on that damp May afternoon, mud clinging to his boots, feeling that strange sense of something off. The neighbors had insisted they'd seen a white car that day. Carter had followed that lead obsessively, but no trace of it was ever found. Until now, the new investigation team used technology that hadn't existed back then. Drones, scanning equipment, ground-penetrating radar. They started with the area near the river, where the groom claimed she'd fallen. But heavy rains over decades had changed the landscape. The river had widened, the bank had shifted. Entire sections were buried under silt and roots. Still, they searched. On the third day, the radar picked up something unusual. A large, metallic anomaly buried beneath an embankment just beyond the woods. It was shaped like a vehicle. The crew began digging. Hours later, mud-covered and exhausted, they uncovered what remained of a white sedan. Its paint dulled to gray, its windows shattered. Inside, they found remnants of fabric, lace faintly white, clinging to the seatbelt. Carter stood at the edge of the site, his heart heavy. The past was surfacing piece by piece. The forensic team worked carefully, brushing away dirt and debris. They opened the glove compartment. Inside was a small, rusted keychain shaped like a bell. The same bell motif that had hung from the church doors on the day of the wedding. When the remains were sent to the lab for analysis, the results came back within a week. Human bone fragments. Female. DNA matched the bride's mother. The old man sat in silence when they told him. He didn't speak for a long time. "So she didn't fall into the river," Carter said quietly. "She was in the car." The groom looked up, eyes hollow. "I swear I never saw the car there. You said you followed her through the woods." "I did." "Then how did her car end up buried a mile away?" He hesitated. The silence that followed was heavier than denial. It was memory. "Because I wasn't the only one who followed her," he said finally. Carter pressed him for details, and slowly, the past began to unfold again. This time differently. He said that morning, when she left the house, he'd seen her heading toward the woods. He followed her from a distance, calling out. But before he could reach her, he'd heard another sound. An engine. A car moving slowly down the back road. The same white car the neighbor had seen. stopped just ahead of her. She hesitated. Then she walked toward it. "I thought maybe she knew him," he said. "That's why I didn't run." Carter's jaw tightened. "You told me last time you never saw anyone." "I didn't want to believe it," he whispered. "Not back then. Not for years." He said. The car door opened. A man stepped out, tall, wearing a dark jacket. She said something, but the words were lost to the wind. Then there was shouting. She turned, tried to run. The man grabbed her arm. The groom ran forward, but before he could reach them, the car sped off. Tires kicking up mud and gravel, the bride inside. He chased it for a moment before losing sight of it behind the trees. And then, in panic, in shame, he did nothing. "I went home," he said quietly. "I told myself I'd imagined it. Because if I hadn't, it meant I'd let her be taken right in front of me." Carter leaned back, every instinct screaming. The letter, the white car, the shadow in the woods. The missing truth wasn't only guilt. It was fear. "Why didn't you tell us this before?" "Because I didn't know who he was," the man said. "Not then." Carter frowned. "And now?" He looked down. "Now I do." From his coat pocket he pulled out a photograph, faded and creased. Two young men in their 20s, arms slung around each other, smiling in front of a hardware store. Carter recognized him instantly, the groom, decades younger, and beside him another man. "Who's that?" Carter asked. "My best friend," the groom said. "Or at least he was. He used to help me at the shop. He was at the wedding too, or supposed to be. But he never showed up." Carter flipped the photo over. A name was scribbled on the back. A name the police had once interviewed briefly in 1998, then dismissed. No motive, no evidence. But when they searched old employment records, they found something. The friend had left town days after the wedding, sold his truck, closed his bank account, disappeared. No trace of him since. The white sedan, Carter realized, had belonged to him. The discovery opened a wound no one expected. As forensic teams began combing through archives, they uncovered receipts, gas station logs, toll records, showing that the man had been seen traveling north the night of the disappearance. And inside the buried car, investigators found something else. A second set of fingerprints, faint but recoverable, pressed into the interior handle. They belonged to him. It wasn't the bride who'd driven the car. She'd been in the passenger seat. Carter called the groom back for questioning. He seemed smaller now, fragile, as if every breath cost effort. "You said you didn't know who it was," Carter began. "So why are we finding his fingerprints in her car?" The groom's eyes filled with tears. "Because I gave him the keys." The confession deepened. He explained that weeks before the wedding, his friend had come to him asking for money. He was struggling, desperate. The groom had lent him some, enough to get by. But the friend kept coming back, threatening to reveal secrets from their youth if he didn't pay more. Foolish things, reckless things, years before he'd met her. The groom refused. The friend became erratic. He said he'd found out about the bride's past, about the man she once knew. He said she wasn't who she pretended to be. The groom told him to stay away from her. "He laughed," the groom said bitterly. "Said she'd find out what kind of man I really was before the wedding. So when the bride mentioned a white car watching her, he thought it was her imagination. Anxiety, nerves. But it wasn't. He'd gone to confront his friend the day before the wedding. They argued. He threw a punch. The friend left, furious. The next morning, the bride disappeared. "I think he took her," the groom said, voice breaking. "And when she tried to run, he drove off the road." Carter's hands trembled slightly as he closed the folder. The pieces were fitting together painfully, perfectly. Not a deliberate murder, but a chain of fear, lies, and cowardice that led to tragedy. A week later, search teams began combing through property records of the friend's family. They discovered that his late uncle had owned a small cabin deep in the woods, about 10 miles from town. The place had been abandoned for decades. When they arrived, the door was padlocked. Inside, dust covered everything: tools, boxes, old newspapers. In the corner of the single room stood a decaying trunk. Inside were personal items. A pocket watch, some letters, and a photograph of the bride, smiling. The photo was creased, handled many times. And beside it, folded neatly, was a wedding invitation addressed in her handwriting, but never sent. It was addressed to him, the friend. Carter stared at it for a long time. The case was now clear. Obsession, jealousy, panic, and silence. The man who'd loved her from afar, the friend who couldn't let go, had taken her that day. Perhaps to plead, perhaps to threaten, perhaps both. When she resisted, he fled. The car lost control, sank into the embankment, buried by time. And the groom, too ashamed, too terrified, let the story rot beneath the surface for 25 years. When Carter told him, he didn't react. He simply stared at the floor, eyes unfocused. He killed her, Carter said. But you let her stay gone. The groom nodded faintly. Because I couldn't bear what that said about me. That you were innocent? No, he whispered. That I'd rather be blamed than face what really happened. He paused, then looked up. Because if I'd gone after her sooner, if I'd just believed her, she might have lived. The investigation closed quietly. There was no trial, no headlines. The friend had long since died. An accident overseas, unconnected to the crime. The body was never recovered. But the evidence was enough to rewrite the story that had haunted Elmsridge for decades. Still, Carter couldn't shake one question. Why had the bride written that letter? Why did she seem to know something terrible was coming? He returned to the envelope again, studying her handwriting. The word truth seemed underlined twice. Then, on the back, he noticed a faint indentation. A second line written faintly beneath the fold. He tilted it under the light. Tell him I forgive him. That night, Carter visited the groom one last time. The old man sat by the window, a white rose in a glass beside him. Snow was falling again, soft and unbroken. You should see this, Carter said, handing him the note. He read it slowly, lips trembling. For the first time in years, his eyes softened. Not with guilt, but with release. She knew, he whispered. Even then. Carter nodded. She did. The room was silent for a long while. Then the groom said, almost to himself, when I saw her walking into the woods that morning, I thought she was leaving me, but she was trying to protect me from him. He looked out toward the dark horizon where the woods once swallowed her path. And I let her go alone. As Carter left the house, he paused by the old gate, the same one that had faced the road where the white car once waited. The moon was high, casting long shadows through the trees. He thought about how easily truth hides, not in what's unknown, but in what's too painful to face. Inside, the groom sat in silence, the letter in his hands. The snow thickened outside. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled, faint and hollow, as if time itself were remembering. He closed his eyes. For the first time in 25 years, he didn't hear the river. Only her voice, soft and forgiving, carried on the wind. The confession spread through Elmsridge like an echo. Not loud, not sudden, but slow and steady, moving through the years and faces that had quietly aged around the story. For 25 years, people had whispered about what happened to the bride who vanished on her wedding day. Now they whispered about why. The police closed the case quietly. There were no trials, no cameras, no spectacle. Only a few signatures, a sealed report, and the quiet understanding that the truth at last had surfaced, though far too late to heal the people it had hurt most. But for one man, the truth didn't close anything. It opened everything. The groom, now an old man living in the same wooden house by the woods, stopped leaving his porch after that winter. Neighbors said they saw him sitting there at dusk, staring at the river through the bare trees, a letter always in his hand. He didn't speak to many, though once, when the postman brought him a parcel, he said softly, "It's strange, isn't it? How silence keeps you company longer than forgiveness." Inside the house, the rooms had changed little since the day she vanished. The wedding photos, the ones taken during rehearsal, still hung on the wall. Two faces smiling beneath the church bells. The dress was gone, but the shoes still sat in the corner of the bedroom, untouched, dust settling like frost. Every year, on the day that would have been their anniversary, he placed a white rose by the church gate and another on the riverbank. He never stayed to watch them fall, but people often found him walking home slowly afterward, as if the act itself had become his only form of prayer. One morning, in early spring, Detective Carter drove up the narrow lane leading to the house. The snow had melted, leaving a pale mist over the fields. He hadn't seen the groom since the night he'd given him the letter's hidden message. As he stepped onto the porch, he noticed the old man sitting quietly, coat buttoned, hands folded. The letter lay open beside him. The air smelled faintly of rain and lilac. "You came," the groom said without looking up. "I wasn't sure you would." "You wrote," Carter replied. "Said there was something left to show me." The old man nodded toward the table beside him. On it lay a small wooden box, the kind used to hold keepsakes. Its lid was carved with a single bell, the same shape as the church ones. Carter sat down slowly. "What is it?" "Something I found while going through her things," he said. "I thought the letter was the last thing she left. But there was one more." He opened the box carefully. Inside was a cassette tape. The label faded, but a few words still legible in her handwriting. "For him if I'm gone." Carter felt a chill. "Have you listened to it?" The old man shook his head. "Not yet. I couldn't." He stared out toward the woods. "But I think I have to now." Carter nodded slowly, reaching for the small portable player the man had set beside the box. The tape clicked softly into place. A faint hiss filled the air, the sound of time preserved in static. Then a voice, soft, trembling, familiar. "If you're hearing this, I suppose I couldn't say it in person." The groom closed his eyes. "You've always said you don't believe in signs, but I've had a feeling for weeks now that something's coming. Maybe I'm imagining it, maybe it's nerves. But if anything happens to me, I want you to know, I was never running from you." The old man's hand tightened on the armrest. "You once told me you don't believe people can love someone completely if they're hiding something. Maybe you're right. So here's mine. Years ago, before I met you, I made mistakes. I trusted the wrong person. I thought it was over, but sometimes the past doesn't forgive the way we hope it will." She paused, her breath trembling through the static. "I think he's back. I've seen his car. I didn't want to worry you before the wedding, because you've already carried enough. But if I disappear, please don't let it destroy you. Tell the truth, even if it hurts. That's the only way it ends." Silence, then a faint exhale. "And one more thing, if you ever find this, I want you to know that loving you was the one thing I never regretted. Not once." The tape clicked off. Neither man spoke for a long time, only the faint wind against the porch boards. Finally, the groom whispered, "She was saying goodbye even then." "She wasn't," Carter said softly. "She was asking you to live." The following days passed in quiet reflection. Carter filed his final report, the one that would close the case for good. But before he sealed the envelope, he added one last line to the official summary. Truth was not withheld out of malice, but out of love twisted by fear. It wasn't police language, but it was the truth. He visited the church once more. The bells still hung above the entrance, though they rang now only for funerals or Sunday service. He remembered the day they were meant to ring for the wedding, bright and careless, echoing across the hills. How strange, he thought, that the same sound that once promised joy could later carry the weight of mourning. That evening, he returned to the house again. But the porch was empty. The wooden box was gone. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air was still warm from the fire. On the table lay a note written in trembling script. "Detective, thank you for giving me back her voice. I'm going to do what I should have done years ago. Tell her parents the truth. Whatever peace comes after that, I'll accept it." Took 2 days before Carter received the call. A passing fisherman had found an empty boat adrift near the old riverbank. Inside were 2 things, the wooden box and a single white rose. No body was recovered. No footprints led back to shore. The official record listed it as presumed accidental drowning. But those who knew him or thought they did believed differently. They said he went there on purpose, not to die, but to let go, to finally return to where the silence began. Some even claimed that at sunset, when the water was calm, they heard the faint sound of bells drifting from across the valley. Years passed. Elms Ridge changed. New houses were built, new families moved in. But the old story lingered, softened by time, reshaped by memory. Children grew up hearing it as a legend. The bride who vanished and the groom who followed the bells. Most thought it a myth. But those who'd been there, those who remembered the faces, the cold mornings, the unanswered questions, carried it like a quiet ache. Detective Carter retired for good that year. On his final day, he took the case file from the archives and drove to the edge of the river. The fields were green again, the air clear. He stood for a long time watching the current move, slow, steady, endless. Then, with a sigh, he let the folder slip from his hand into the water. The papers unfolded briefly, catching the light, before the river carried them downstream. Sometimes, when he walked past the church, he thought he heard the bells again. Faint, far away. Not mournful, but peaceful. As if forgiveness had finally found a home. He often thought about the line in her letter, "Tell him I forgive him." He'd come to believe it wasn't just for the man who confessed. It was for all of them, the ones who looked away, who whispered, who built stories around silence instead of truth. In the end, it wasn't a crime that haunted Elms Ridge. It was love, the kind that, when left unspoken too long, becomes its own ghost. Every spring, when the lilacs bloom along the old road, travelers sometimes notice a white rose left on the bridge railing above the river. No one knows who puts it there. Some say it's her spirit. Others say it's him, keeping his promise, somewhere unseen. But if you stand there long enough, when the wind moves just right, you might hear it too. That faint sound of distant bells, ringing not for a wedding, nor for a funeral, but for something simpler. For truth. For forgiveness. For the silence that finally learned to speak.